Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. This is our September series of colloquia dedicated to the Europe's Futures Fellows who are in residence here in September. Last Monday, we had the pleasure to hear our first two presenters. And today we will hear our fellows Péter Krekó and Alida Vračić. Péter Krekó will go first. Péter comes to us from Budapest, where he's the director of a think tank, Political Capital. And he's also a fellow at SAIS in Bologna, suspended because he's a fellow now here with us. He has recently published a book with his colleague Attila Juhász, The Hungarian Far Right, which I think was presented in Vienna also when it came out. The subtitle is Social Demand, Political Supply, and the International Context. And today he will give us a talk with a PowerPoint presentation on tribal politics and its effects. So Péter, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction, Ivan, and thanks also for the Institute of Human Sciences for having me here, and also for the Erste Foundation for supporting that I'm here. The topic that I will talk about is originally conceptual and theoretical, but as Kurt Lewin, famous social psychologist from the 20th century, said, there is nothing more practical than a good theory. So my concept, tribalism, tries not only explain the political tendencies and phenomena in the Western world these days, but also have some practical implication in terms of perception of corruption, demographic politics, the perception of foreign interference by specific group voters, democratic transgressions, and so on and so on. So given that it's a conceptual exercise, I'm practically, let's say, halfway in the work, or even before, so I'm really happy to hear all of your insights and reactions to the topic I will talk about. And probably I'm superficial enough to always choosing topics that everyone can connect to a certain extent. So already had the experience here at IWM that whoever I talk to about my topics have usually far better ideas than I have about my topic. But the good thing is that finally, if I write a book, then I can pour all this knowledge I hear from others and good thoughts into there. So practically, my talk would come from, or I would start with saying that the term tribalism for me is practically an alternative to the term that is quite usually used and I think abused in discussions these days, and this is populism. And I would not say that everything what has been written on populism so far is bad. No, not at all. I read and quote the scholars of populism a lot of time, and I think they had some very good. Some of them had some very good thoughts about the nature of the phenomenon. Also, I don't think that what I will say about tribalism is something totally new that others haven't said so far. But I think when we talk about populism, it's wrong in the current context in the Western world is wrong for at least two reasons. One is that it's often an understatement. Let's take a look at who are the politicians who are usually labeled as populists these days. One of them is my beloved Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. So how much is a politician can be labeled as a populist who, for example, makes it more difficult to have referenda in the country and raises the threshold of validity for the referenda because he's afraid that in some issues, when he becomes a bit more unpopular, people can challenge him on power. So what usually populists do on power is that they demolish the democratic institutions. And populism is a term that can only be understood in the democratic context. So populism is not about, cannot be really defined in dictatorships because the legitimacy basis of populism is the will of the majority and the opinion of the majority. The second point why I'm rather dissatisfied with the term populism is that especially when it comes to parties on power, like Law and Justice in Poland or Fidesz in Hungary, what we can find is that in the voter basis of these parties, there is nothing you can find about the traditional features of populism. So the minimalist traditional definition of populism narrows it down to two elements. One is so-called people-centrism, some kind of identification with the people, and anti-elitism. So we the people are against the elites. And let me show you what we did in a research a few years ago, in the end of 2017, is that we tried to measure the populist attitudes in Poland and Hungary, in two countries where populists, so-called populists, are on power, and let's see how their voter bases resonate to their messages. And of course, I mean, how, for example, Viktor Orbán talks or how Kaczynski talks are textbook cases of populism. For example, Viktor Orbán said in one of his speeches that you can see how in many European countries the distance between the people and their democratically elected governments increases day by day. One of my ministers will be responsible for ensuring that this does not happen to us in Hungary. I asked him to persevere in finding points of consensus between the people and the government. So, textbook case of populism. One quote from Kaczynski. Kaczynski once said practically that vox populi vox dei. So it's the classical populist narrative that we are on the side of the electorate. We are the people against the elites. Let's take a look at how much. Okay, that how does it appears in the voter basis of these parties? First, let's take a look at people-centrism in Hungary. So people-centrism is about an attitude that we, the people, serve somehow as a community here. There were items such as like the most important driving force of politics should be the will of the people and things like that. Quite, I mean, statements that more or less everyone agrees with, but Fidesz voters, so voters of the Hungarian governmental party that is often labeled to be populist, I think they, according to the figures, they tended to agree a bit less with these people-centrist statements than most of the opposition parties. So we cannot say that this is something as a differentiating feature of the voter base of Fidesz. If we take a look at anti-elitism, so there are items that practically saying, yes, the elite is corrupt, and they are working behind the curtains, and they are conspiring against us, and so on and so on. And of course, from a common sense, not so unsurprisingly, Fidesz voters are not so anti-elitist, given that their party is the elite, is the domestic elite in Hungary at least, and all the opposition parties in this measurement seem to be more anti-elitist than Fidesz voters are. If we even take a look at the Polish results, we can see that political anti-elitism scores are rather lower than average as well in the voter base of Law and Justice, even if the differences are rather small in the whole sample and across the groups, but still it's not a differentiating feature of law and justice voters neither. So we could see in these two cases, Poland and Hungary, that nor anti-elitism nor people-centrism are really a feature of the attitudes of the voters of governing parties that are labeled to be Fidesz. Let's look a bit beyond EU member states and in Central Eastern Europe. For example, this is a research by esteemed colleagues that found that anti-elite orientation, for example, in Montenegro, is one of the lowest among the voters of Milo Djukanovic's party, while Djukanovic is also often labeled as populist. A scholar called his regime state-sponsored populism, for example. So anti-elitism is low. Again, if you're on power, you're not anti-elitist anymore. And the same in Serbia. The voters of Alexander Vučić, according to a poll in 2016, were the least anti-elite among all the voters. And the differences here, we can say, are rather high. And if we even take a look at the trust in politicians, so the statement is most politicians are trustworthy. I mean, statement that most of the people tend to fundamentally disagree with, but we can see that among the disagreement there is a group that tends to agree a bit more with it, and this is again the voters of Alexander Vučić. So my argument would be that populism is practically a rhetorical strategy that aim to mobilize the electorate with people-centrism, with anti-elitism, if you're in opposition. But if you become a governmental party, then I would not say it changes its nature, but the mask simply falls down, and what usually it comes to is something quite different. So what are these different things? What did we found in the survey in Poland and Hungary about what are the distinctive features of attitudes of Fidesz and law and justice voters? Manichaean worldview. Some says it's part of populism, some says it's not, but it's this kind of understanding of politics as a fundamental war between the good and the evil is something as a very important feature of voter base of Fidesz. Interestingly, there was another group where this kind of attitude found to be pretty strong. Here, this specific statement was that you can tell if a person is good or bad if you know their politics. Supporters of a left-wing liberal party that is led by a former Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány, among his voter base, this kind of Manichaean worldview was pretty strong as well. And of course, this kind of Manichaean worldview is to a certain extent an antithesis of democracy, because it practically says that the other side is evil. Therefore, of course, we are the only legitimate leaders or possible leaders. In Poland, we found something similar, that supporters of law and justice were far the most Manichaean in their approach. So they also tended to differentiate between people and their morale just on the basis of their political attitudes. So this is something that seems to be an important element when it comes, at least in two cases, for so-called populists who are in power. Pluralism is another important feature. So Fidesz voters tended to be the least pluralistic, I mean, least supportive towards, let's say, disagreement within the whole society, disagreement within their own political camp, and so on and so on. And we found the same for Poland as well. Okay. So if we take a look at these examples, I think we find that Manichaean worldview and anti-pluralism are two very important elements when it comes to the social psychological background of the so-called populism that I will call tribalism from now on. And we found a third important element, and this is authoritarianism. So in my definition, political tribalism, which of course differs from the traditional forms of tribalism that we can find in the literature of pre-modern societies, and there are some literature about contemporary literature as well, let's say about the Albanian society or so on and so on, that this kind of classical nepotistic roots in the society, it's something different because it's a more modern phenomenon, but it has three important features: many-hand worldview, understanding of politics as a tribal war, with the main goal of defeating the other tribe. The second one is anti-pluralism, so lack of tolerance towards the dissent in the own tribe, and to a certain extent pushing for one specific narrative. And the third one is authoritarianism, that was also found to be pretty strong in both Fidesz and both law and justice voter base, which is rallying around the leader of the tribe. So if we have these three elements, and as I said, there was one empirical research when we tested this model, so it should be tested further. But what we found is that this attitude set comes together with one other thing that makes it more malevolent than populism, that the term populism implies, and this is support for political violence. So the voters of Fidesz and Law and Justice who had this kind of attitude set, and among the voters of Fidesz and Law and Justice, these tribalist voters were overrepresented. They tended to think that violence is a legitimate tool of solving political conflicts. And I think here the big question is that why do we call this attitude set really as populism, in the sense that it goes well beyond democratic standards. It's practically the antithesis of democratic standards and values. And I would say that why the term populism implies that there is such a thing as identifying with the people, I haven't really found anyone in the world who identified themselves with the people in general. I think everyone likes to identify themselves with one particular group, but not with the universal feature of the people. And social psychological research also suggests that we all tend to think that we or our particular group is more special than others, is above the general, above the average. Why the term people would only imply that we are quite okay with being the members of the average. I think most of the people not. So when the question comes here is that is populism, because all the examples that I came up so far were the tribalism of the so-called right-wing populists. So is tribalism necessarily a right-wing phenomenon or not? I would say no. And even in the example we brought up in Hungary, for example, we found that one left-wing party, I mean, whose voter base is really historical in many sense. If you tend to disagree with them in any issues publicly, then all their trolls come against you and attack you personally and so on and so on. So they, I mean, even everyday experiences support that they are rather tribalist in this sense. So we had this example. Nowoczesna voters tended to be more tribal than most of the opposition voters. It was in a time when Nowoczesna was a separate party. In Poland, a liberal party than the rest of the parties. So we can see that there is such a thing as left-wing populism. I do think if we can come up with a few examples, I mean, it's highly hypothetical without empirical evidence, but I think hardcore Remainers, for example, who tend to say that, okay, let's just ignore the popular vote in the Brexit referendum because Great Britain has to stay in the UK anyway. I think it has some tribal elements. When I was in the United States in 2006, and it was just a time when Donald Trump was elected, and of course in the university bubble that I mainly moved in, everyone was extremely depressed, and there were a lot of calls and Facebook calls by my, let's say, quite sensible university teacher colleagues that, for example, the Electoral college should totally ignore the electoral results and they should not vote for Donald Trump. I mean, what is the how realistic it is that and there were real, assessment that the electoral college this time will not elect Donald Trump. So this kind of tribal mindsets with a highly strong motivated reasoning, I think, can emerge in left-wing environments as well. I had a discussion with Nicolo on my topic at one of the lunches. He came up with the example of Varoufakis's movement that has also some features of this kind of tribalism, with a very charismatic leader and with a very strong closed mindset. Bernie Sanders' voters, and the list goes on. But I think it's not just by mistake that if we look around the world, right-wing tribalists are way more successful than left-wing tribalists. And this is because I think this kind of particular tribal mindset that denies the universal morale and practically expresses its clear demand for particularism. It's something that is traditionally closer to conservative or right-wing ideologues in its approach, and also the anthropological pessimism of conservative philosophies such as, let's say, Hobbes, Burke, or Scruton. It's more close to this kind of tribalist mindset because practically, to totally oversimplify it, the statement is that the mankind is bad anyway, and it's like we cannot really create a perfect society. Why even try to? It's impossible to create the welfare for everyone. So let's just defend our own group and admit that we are not that much interested in others. So, and right-wing populists, or I would say tribalists, are quite open these days in admitting that they do not really care about universal values. So the 5 features of political tribalism that I think I find the most important one. First of all, tribal politics always needs leaders of the tribe. So this cannot really, as I said, authoritarianism is an important part of the system, and it again goes against the traditional notion of populism, which something assumes that it's somehow a collective phenomenon, but the person of the leader is extremely important, and the personal mobilization, as this rallying around the charismatic leader, seems to be an important precondition. The second thing is tribalism, and this is what mainly distinguishes it from populism. Populism, the term populism would imply that the people hate the elite. So it's something like horizontal, vertical hatred. Comes bottom up. But at the same time, what I would assume is that this kind of tribalist mindset is rather horizontal in the sense that follows the classical logic of the intergroup conflicts, where the most important story is not the hatred of the elites, but the hatred of some kind of other tribe. Also, right-wing tribalism is much more about the circus than about the breadth. So, and Francis Fukuyama had, I think, a very important observation in his book Identity. He says that while most of the political conflicts of the second half of the 20th century could be characterized with material questions and redistribution issues, the late 20th century and early 21st century is rather for the identity conflicts, and its identity dominates and trumps all other aspects. And of course, tribal politics are really happy to use this tool. For example, when there are some problems with policies in Hungary, in healthcare, in education, and elsewhere, let's point to the migrant hordes that are just flooding our country, and we have to defend our nation from that. And then, of course, it elevates the political rhetoric and the political discussion to a way higher and more civilizational level, and it kills every possibility for policy discussions. So it's much more about identity than about money. And it also relies on the loud minorities and not the silent majorities. This is what Kasmuda usually argues, famous scholar of populism. Everybody knows that while right-wingers these days call themselves the representatives of the silent majority, in fact, they are usually the loud minority. And there were cases, and I would say that the most notable exception is the US presidential election in 2016, where a group that is numerically in minority could win an election via stronger mobilization. Probably the Brexit referendum is something that can be mentioned as well. We will never really know that if the polls that were predicting remain as the majority were simply false, or it was just the Leave campaign that mobilized less. But I think politics these days, and that's why the mainstream changed so a lot, is not about winning the hearts and minds of the majority, but about winning the hearts and minds of a tribe. And if the other tribe hates you, it's not a problem, it's an asset that you can use for mobilization in this concept of this eternal war. And the last point is that, and that's why I think that this kind of what I would say tribalist zeitgeist can be so strong and sometimes powerful, is that tribal politics have some kind of ancient power, and it's a more, let's say, sincere, more rude, but at the same time, for a lot of people, a more easy to identify with, a more natural form of politics than the, let's say, to be frank, quite artificial norms that were created in liberal democratic regimes. So what is the, let's say, theoretical background of this whole concept of tribalism that I relied on so far, but open to any new suggestions for readings? First of all, the general social psychology literature, which emphasizes the importance of intergroup conflicts, and the social identity theory that says practically that identity is for everyone. Social identity is something that drives our attitudes and behavior as well, in a lot of cases when we are not really aware of. Evolutionary social psychology, like Cedinus and Pratto's social dominance orientation, which is a highly controversial theory, because it practically says that evolutionary in a group selection process, the tribes that could create, let's say, more efficient, vertically hierarchical order and suppressive order to a certain extent, they enjoyed some advantage in the fight for survival when the tribes were fighting with each other. So to a certain extent, this kind of vertical hierarchy is inevitable, and a certain level of oppression emerges in all social contexts because it's something like an evolutionary heritage. Of course, it can be overcome, but and it would be my argument, it's like, of course, not like tribal politics is the more natural form of politics, therefore we should praise it, we should embrace it, we should love it. It can be overwritten by democratic norms, but when the members of the political game and the political leaders and the political parties feel that they have way more advantage of buying into this tribal mindset, go for post-truth politics, go for this kind of tribal conflicts, fueling identity-based conflicts, then of course the democratic norms can easily erode, and the politics can let's say, get back to this more natural form of operation. And of course, as I said, the modern political science literature that usually emphasizes the importance of identity and symbolic politics in elections these days way more than, let's say, the more traditional forms of political science literature that based on the economic approach were much more emphasizing this, the importance of redistribution. So, and yeah, what's okay, you can agree or disagree with what I've said so far, but you're probably raising the question anyway, that, okay, and so what? So what do we explain by the end of the day? What can we do with this concept? And let me come up with a few examples on what are the consequences of this kind of tribal mindset that I don't think that the term populism can explain pretty well. First of all, there are a lot of polls from the Western world that shows that corruption is not something, I mean, increasingly corruption scandals are unable to destroy the image of the politicians. And why is it so? Because there are a lot of studies prove that it's not just like if I'm voting for a party, let's say Fidesz in Hungary, then I just tend to tolerate the corruption of my beloved leader, but I find it as a merit, because in a tribal war you have to collect resources to defeat the other tribes. So, and even one so-called philosopher behind the Hungarian government right now, director of Corvinus University, he famously told once that what others call as corruption, we call it the real rationale of Fidesz politics. And what did he mean by that is that in order to be able to keep the power, we have to build up a national bourgeoisie. Therefore, we have to collect the resources the way that it is built up. And how much is it populist? Again, if you openly say you want to create a national bourgeoisie, it's about building up new elites. Also, selective norms towards democratic transgressions. What could be seen in Polish polls, in Hungarian polls, but also some polls and experimental survey results in the United States is that people not just tend to tolerate some kind of, in some cases, the democratic transgressions of their own leaders, but again, finding them as heroic acts, because if you fight an eternal tribal war, of course you need to occupy institutions in order to be able to keep the power, otherwise it will be impossible. Belief in fake news and conspiracy theories. This is also something that I think can well explained with tribalism. I tend to disagree with some part of the social psychological literature that we tend to believe in fake news and conspiracy theories because we are cognitively lazy. What would it mean that if you just pay a bit more attention, then problem solved and everyone is happy and the fake news sites are just disappearing? But I think it's not the thing. The thing is that people will be happy to embrace fake news and conspiracy theories in a highly polarized tribal conflict until they feel that it helps their own camp. For example, let's come up with the example of the Pizzagate conspiracy theory before the 2016 presidential election. Half of the Republican voters believed that Hillary Clinton, John Podesta, and the whole campaign staff of Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring while they were running the campaign as well. Let's imagine how good time management skills it require. But it sounds like total stupidity. But at the same time, it proved to be a winning narrative that a lot of right-wing, let's say, pundits were spreading as well. And Michael Flynn was posting about it and so on and so on. So after a while, why to abandon this kind of notions even if they are untrue? If they prove to be the winning narrative, and the same with the George Soros conspiracy theory in Hungary. I talked to some right-wingers who tell that, of course, I mean, I know to a certain extent that it's bullshit, but you know, it helps us to win the elections. And it's a good thing by the end of the day. And of course, there is a difference between the fanatics and the cynical members of a voting base. But anyway, this kind of tribal myth logic that we need some kind of weaponized information to defeat the other tribe, I think it explains, and identity politics explains way better the belief in fake news than this kind of cognitive laziness. And foreign interference. Let me show, there were at least 4 cases, but I will just talk about very briefly about 3, where we could see that it turned out that a politician is supported by certain ways by Russia to get the power or boost popularity. And when it turned out, their voters were totally reluctant to turn away from them, which I think, again, can be explained by tribal politics, because in a tribal war, you need allies. You need sometimes foreign allies. If Vladimir Putin helps my beloved president to get elected, what's the problem? I will just like him even more. So, so what happened in Austria? So there was the Ibiza Gate scandal, which is, of course, it did not prove in any way that FPÖ itself is financed by Russia, but it definitely proved that there would be a demand for that. And what happened after the Ibiza Gate scandal? I mean, FPÖ's popularity was about 22% back then. It showed a slight decrease, and right now it's 20%. Is it a dramatic decline? I mean, practically leading politicians of this party told that they would be happy to betray their own country just to serve some Russian oligarchs, and it had almost no impact on the popularity of the party. The same story happened in Italy, where it practically, and it's even proven even more since then, that Lega Nord has its quite shady financial times with people close to the Kremlin. There was an audio tape revealed and transcripts and all of that. What happened with Lega Nord's popularity? Nothing. It's like there was a decline, but it was afterwards, but it was much more the result of the governmental breakup. So at the time of Moscow Gate, Lega's popularity was about 36%. Right now it's 33%. So it did not make an impact. And what happened in the United States when it turned out that Russia interfered into the election and helped Vladimir Putin? Republican voters just liked more Putin, and Putin became simply more sympathetic to them, contrary to the Democrats who were traditionally way more dovish towards Russia, but because of that they turned against Russia. So again, it's what is a general feature of this kind of tribal politics is that it's totally it's based on total moral particularism. I mean, we can do it, we have to do it. I mean, as far as it helps our own tribe, but we don't really care about general, artificial, abstract democratic norms, because these are not really helping us, and we don't have to deal that much with rules. And it would be my final slide. So, and one last element, and this is where Alida's talk, I think, will fit perfectly, would be about demography and emigration and immigration. And Joshua Green, in his work Tribal Politics, Moral Tribes, he made one very important remark. I will quote him directly. The tribal difference that erupts into public controversy typically concerns sex. For example, gay marriage, gays in the military, sex lives of public officials, and death at the margins of life. Abortion, physician-assisted suicide, the use of embryonic stem cell in research. That such issues are moral issues is surely not arbitrary. Sex and death are the gas pedals and brakes of tribal growth. So the most important issues these days in politics as well in Central Eastern Europe is about immigration. I mean, other tribe is coming with different, and there are a lot of tribal myths surrounding that. They are coming, a lot of young male are coming, they will rape our women, they will occupy our territory, they will kill our own men, and so on and so on. And people finally, who are not so much concerned about non-consensual sex traditionally, are rather concerned when these are the immigrants who want to rape the women. There was recently a demographic conference, a summit in Budapest, where there was the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, it's Alexander Vučić and Andrej Babiš, and the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, and there was really a big show of people coming up. I mean, what is missing from this picture?
No women.
no women. It's like the leaders of the tribe are just discussing that the women should give birth to more children. And it's like, why let the women to interfere into such important things? They are biased anyway, but it's better to discuss it among ourselves. And practically, there were a lot of lashes out, not directly from the prime minister, because he delegated the most dirty words to his subordinates, but it was like bashing gay because they are so selfish that they don't want to give birth to other children. And having a children, as one of the speaker of the conference said, is not a private issue, it's a public affair. So you cannot just decide it on your own. And singles were lashed out at, of course, abortion and all these issues. So the most controversial issues that are surrounding politics these days, and I think it's like that in the United States, in Central Eastern Europe and so on, are all about the questions of tribal politics. How big my tribe will be, will it diminish, will not? What are the policies that can make it stronger? How much we are afraid from other tribes coming and defeat us, and so on and so on. And okay, what to do all about that? So what is the solution? I honestly don't know. I probably will have some good ideas about it. What we know for sure is that what not helps tribal conflicts to disappear. And the most typical response, and that's why I also say populism is a bad term, because it implies that there is a conflict between the people and the elite. So what is the solution? Better redistributive policies that will just create a strong middle class and the whole thing will be over. No, totally wrong. Let's take a look at, for example, the Trump voter base in 2016. The well-off voters were much likely to vote for Trump than for Hillary Clinton. So it was not the revolution of the blue-collar people. It was a tribal identity conflict. I mean, for example, yeah, race was way more important in predicting the electoral result than income, or let's say education. Also, what we know is that if we want to solve tribal conflicts, probably, I mean, meeting with the members of the other tribe could help, and this is what social psychology literature tells us, conduct hypothesis and so on and so on, but of course it's too idealistic and it also has its limits. And one final thought that we found in some of our research, and this is, let's say, a semi-empirical, semi-hypothetical statement, is that tribal conflicts are way more easy to be fueled online, but they are much more easy to dilute offline. So, I mean, the online space with its bubbles and so on are quite, make it more difficult to go against the tribal logic. And what is in the book Democracies, How Democracies Die is pretty well described, is that the political elites and, of course, the intellectual elite has a big responsibility in that. I mean, until they feel that tribal conflicts play into their hands, it's really hard to dilute them. But what I find a rather higher problem is that tribalism is not something that only drives political processes these days, but I think extremely and increasingly expert discourses, journalism, and so on and so on. It can make you way more popular if you just talk to your own tribe, and you know where you distort the truth. But if it's a way more winning, coherent narrative, it can make just you more popular. So I think tribalism is also something that we should think about it in a self-reflective manner. So thank you, and sorry for exceeding time here.
Péter, thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes to 20 maximum for Q&A, and before I give the floor, I cannot resist restraining myself to mention, I thought of Ferenc Feher, who a long time ago in a conference in Dubrovnik talked about the pessimist political anthropology and the positive political anthropology of Soviet Russia and Stalin, where, of course, the man, the human being, was the greatest treasure that we had, and at the same time, the negative, pessimist political anthropology was that no political power was allowed to anyone. And so you had this kind of disjointed view, which was, in a sense, a bit of how you stay in power. Okay. Ivan, Holly, and someone else. Ivan first. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I have just 3 questions. First is, you're describing political tribalism just as a characteristic of a certain political players. But if basically you're going to go on the opinion polls, you're going to see that this is much more the characteristic of the changing nature of the political confrontation. So in a certain way, for example, 29% of the Remainers do not believe that they're going to allow their son or daughter to marry somebody who voted for Brexit, and 9% on the other side. So to what extent political tribalism is a characteristic of a political actor, be it a party or group, and to what extent this is basically the end of the consensual politics and basically the rise of something that agonistic politics, something like, for example, others are going to say. Secondly, I do believe in this analysis is populism. You're absolutely right in many of the criticism, but there is one thing important about the idea of the populism, and this is the totally different understanding of majority, democratic majority, when it comes to the populist politics and to the liberal politics. And the story is that in this, because majoritarianism, in my view, is much more important to understand these actors than simply tribal politics, because tribal politics you can have these days in any polarized situation. And as you also show with your own data, Nowoczesna, which would be basically the least tribal of all if you go on the social characteristic and ideology. But majoritarianism means that majorities are not made, majorities are born, and majorities owns the state. So at the moment when the idea of the majority is not present, I do believe when we try to describe certain political party and so on, Bifidus and others, we are much more describing the post-consensual, anti-consensual politics that we have in many places. And if you go with the opinion polls, you're not going to see major difference between the voters of these parties and basically their opponents. For example, the idea that how you vote very much describes who you are. I do believe in Poland these days is going to be equally shared by both the opposition and the government.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I found this tragically quite convincing.
Thank you.
And my question, I have 2. One is, you've given a good, explanation of what this is, right, as opposed to populism, in your view. But one thing that I missed is how you think it started, and whether this has ever happened before, and what sets this kind of thing off, apart from the general statement you made about how this is sort of the natural, the theory about how it's the natural, more natural evolutionary way. Does that mean that one is, that systems are destined to revert to this regularly? And the big problem that I have here is, and that's my second question, is if we assume that it's tribal politics, what's the end game? Because I think if we accept this as a category, the end game has to be that lots of people die, because that's the way that tribalism works. It doesn't stop at some kind of symbolic, level, if we're going to define things in these terms. And so how comfortable are you, accepting the next logical conclusion to that premise that this is tribalism, which is that this ends in a very particular way, and that is with people not just symbolically assassinating each other, but actually assassinating each other. And that's where I'm wondering if the framework that we use to describe these things doesn't also sort of pose the possibilities that we see in the future. And so maybe framing itself is something significant, and that we should be careful before implying that a particular framing with a particular quote-unquote natural end.
Thanks. This was quite interesting to listen to. I'm wondering, I'm having some trouble trying to figure out how certain things Trump has done with the federal government in the United States would fit into your model, because I'm having trouble trying to understand what Trump has done with a lot of federal agencies in the United States would fit into your model, because what he's done is he's gutted them of their expertise, by and large, and he's either left them decimated with just a skeleton crew to run them, which basically means they're ineffective, or he's staffed them with flunkies, people who, by no stretch of the imagination, if you had like just an iota of expertise, belong in those positions. And the fights he picks right now are fights with people he can't control, like the members of the Federal Reserve, who set the interest rates. These are experts, par excellence. And he can't stand it because they refuse to do what he wants because it's insane. I don't see how that kind of behavior jives with what you're saying about his behavior as a tribalist.
Back to you, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks a lot for, let me respond now, because even with paper I have very short memories. Okay, you're really testing me.
Yeah, sorry. I was curious, to what extent do you think on the long term the success is assured by this discourse and the lies and the symbols used and the hate for the other groups versus the economic welfare of people?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so, okay. I will try to respond to these very good questions briefly, while there will be a challenge to respond them quite in a long manner. So first to Ivan's question, to the first part, probably I was not defining well enough what this concept stands for. I do think that is somehow a description of how the logic of politics works, not only on the side of the elites, who buy into tribal political practices, knowing what their results will be, but much more something that is also on the level of the voters themselves. And yes, I think you're totally right. This is what I try to explain as well, that this kind of model that is based on the broad consensus is simply over, it's broken, and mainstream politics these days are simply not playing according to the rules of, let's say, politics a few decades ago. And the question is here as well, I think, why. My explanation would be not a very complicated one, that probably this post-World War II consent is over, that we should let's say, build a very strong center in order to avoid that this tragic things happening. I think the memories of the Second World War are simply not having any impact on politics these days, and this is what we can see, for example, like that when a politician is labeled fascist by the mainstream, it probably rather increases its popularity than decreases. When it comes to majoritarianism, I think it's an important term, and you're right that it shouldn't be left out of the picture. But I do think that we know some cases when people feel, and this is, for example, when it comes to Fidesz, that changed the rules of the referendum in Hungary, not allowing necessarily the majority to raise its will. I think when the majority that always, electorally at least, exists in some form, when the populist is elected, when they are afraid of it starting to erode, it turns into, I think, this kind of particularism and tribal logic. But I think probably it's good to differentiate between populists that are still popular and populists that not, because they behave differently. And I think but even for the populists who are popular, I think they have this kind of tribal mindset because they are afraid that they will lose popularity sooner or later. And then I think even the concept of majoritarianism is more difficult to define. To Holly's questions on what drives all this, of course, I would not like to say that it's just the future of politics and this is where it naturally evolves and it will go into mass murders and huge violent conflicts. Probably it will sound surprising, but in the, let's say, in the Hungarian intellectual spectrum, I rather regard it to be an optimist and not a pessimist. So I do think that it's not, I mean, there is nothing inevitable about that, because my point would be that it's really, I mean, the elite plays a huge role in that, and the discussions and the institutions that try to set the democratic norms matter a lot. There are some who says that what politicians said doesn't matter anymore because everyone hates politicians, but I think it's not true. Even in countries where we can see that, of course, in public opinion polls, everyone hates politicians, but by the end of the day, what politicians say and how they define the norms, what they do about the institutions and so on, it's quite easily becomes some kind of social norm as well. So the reason why I'm a bit worried is that if we take a look at some subsequence of the stories, such as fake news conspiracy theories, we couldn't really see examples from the last, let's say, 4 or 5 days when some kind of post-truth elements did not appear in campaigns, and especially the winning ones were usually the ones where you had more of these post-truth elements. And of course, the orgy of that was the Hungarian electoral campaign, where there is practically no immigrants in Hungary. Still, the only issue that matters immigrants, and everyone was afraid about immigrants. So I think it's not and probably one thing that can make us a bit more optimistic, that I think the tribal politicians will only start a war when they really feel that there is no other option and it will help them. And I don't think that there are too much politicians in the world, and especially, and I think international institutions help in that a lot. I mean, one NATO member state attacks one other, and for what purpose? What does they expect it? I mean, if Viktor Orbán goes mad and attacks another country, I mean, he knows it won't happen because he knows that it won't lead him anywhere. It will lead just losing the power. So probably this kind of international institutions that tribal politicians are mainly against can help a bit, even EU and NATO, to dilute this kind of conflicts. And to your question on Trump and the federal institutions, I mean, I misunderstood what you said, but I think for me it rather fits into the logic, in the sense that in tribal politics you have two options with an institution: either occupy it and turn it to your side, or demolish it. And I think from this bird perspective and superficial perspective I have on US politics, I think what happens more or less fits into the logic. I mean, when you think that these institutions pose a danger for you, let's empty them, let's try to weaken them, let's, not necessarily fill them with loyalists, but just rather let them die. But when it comes to important one, let's say, chief of FBI, CIA, and so on, then try to put there your people, because you know, or the Supreme Court, because you know it's extremely important. And to the last question on the economic drivers, this is what I told, that I think it's really more about identity conflicts than about material conflicts. And of course, and probably it's a response to your question as well on when can it turn really evil. Of course, when there is a fight for survival in the literal sense as well, for the resources, it can make tribal conflicts obviously more rude, more brutal, higher in stake, and more violent. I don't really see it's mainly happening in the Western world. Yes, of course, we can say that inequalities are high, but of course, I mean, in the Western part of the world, inequalities are the lowest if we take a look at it on the global scale. But even in countries where I think there are a fairly high level of welfare, we can see that tribalist politics are on the rise, including Austria, including many others. So that's why I think that, of course, we can argue that for social justice reasons, redistribution should be on the top of the political agenda, but we should not expect that, let's say, a solid middle class will be a cure against tribalist or populist politics.
Okay, a quick question, maybe that's left there, and then we'll wrap it up and move to Alida.
There was also a note on welfare, I think, yes, and
Sorry.
but
if the economy goes well, does it matter what they say, or does it matter who hates whom or who lies, or if it's
Thank you.
it's more important that the economy goes well and then people keep voting for them. You know, like for example in Poland, there's in economical terms and in terms of people returning to the country, it's getting better. So is their popularity due to this or due to their discourse and the tribalism, which is on the long term, which do you think counts more? This was my question.
Sorry for misunderstanding it.
Thank you for the answer.
and may I ask like two short questions? First, a bit in continuation of to which extent it is historically unprecedented if we put it into the broader perspective of politics before the World War II, which was very much polarized and which was not only redistributive or on material base, but very much ideologic. I mean, it was ideologically based, and it was violent throughout the 70s. I mean, in terms of the methods of political struggle. But at the same time, it seems to me that you're speaking about this difference of a different understanding of ideology, because of what you described, it is very much identity politics, but with a different understanding of ideology, if it makes sense. On this point, like how then would you differentiate tribalism versus other types of polarizing politics? And my second question comes from the tribe, because tribes get its power because of the social interaction, because for the tribe, the initially sharing norms or identity, it comes as a package of these very immediate and direct social interactions, which was both for the tribes in the early history, but also for subcultures. So how the tribe then is formed, so with this efficacy of immediate interactions, does social media or social kind of this new means play a role providing this basis for this new medium? So thank you.
Okay, Ivan, yeah, briefly.
For me, one thing is very interesting. If you go with political tribalism, so the liberal state or the liberal players, even when they pretend that they're interested in the well-being of everybody in the community. Even this is not true. Rhetorically, this is the case. So what is interesting about the type of politics that you talk about is that normally you're saying that those who do not vote for you, basically, you're not interested to represent them. They don't matter, they're not true Hungarians, they're not true Poles, and so on. And this goes about the conditions. To what extent the absence of war, I mean the war between states, makes this civil war with ballots much more easier. Before you need, in a time of external crisis, also to depend on the fact that those who are not voting for you are going to fight next to you. To what extent, paradoxically, the fact that a kind of a real war is out of the imagination makes this type of a politics much easier? So this is my question.
Very good. Okay, back to briefly, please.
Yeah, I will be brief. Okay, regarding your question on how much is it because of economic success, it's really hard to judge. I think we have to wait and see until economics will go bad in Poland and Hungary. I think if my assessment is right, that it's not that much about economics, which I mean it can prove wrong, but it probably will not destroy in itself the popularity of these governments. And in tribal politics, you always, I think, prepare for the worst in the sense that you introduce the, let's say, familiar scapegoats that you can point on when there is some economic trouble. Yeah, as it happened in the Turkey, of course, with highly limited success, we can say that. But the depreciation of the Turkish lira and all the economic troubles are just because of the United States, of George Soros or whatever. We could hear it in Russia. We could hear it. We could hear it when there were some economic troubles in Hungary as well. The problem I think is when the economy goes down, that you usually have to raise the stakes and put, let's say, this kind of rhetorical war you're usually waging into something that makes, has a higher stake. And this is what I think reduces, or it can increase the chance of some kind of violent conflicts. But I think it's not a, let's say, a deterministic fate that if the economy goes down, that the tribal politics goes down. Of course, it's always always easier to be more popular than in growth than in decline. The interesting thing about the last Hungarian election was that let's say, there was almost 5% economic growth, unprecedentedly low unemployment, real wage rises of more than 10% for 2 consecutive years, and so on and so on. The government almost didn't talk about it. They always also almost talk only about migrants and George Soros and so on and so on. So this kind of tribal conflict. So I mean, tribal logic, I think this kind of micromanagement of policy issues, it's not something that fits rather well into this tribal logic after a while. About the question on the on social interactions, yeah, of course I thought about how much what I'm telling is something new. I do think that, yeah, one new element of the tribal politics these days is that there are the technological tools that makes it easier to do it. And what we can see all around the world these days, let's say ISIS propaganda, anti-science theories, tribalism, and so on and so on. So medieval thoughts are very easily can be spread via 21st century technological tools. And in some cases, we feel that these are the guys who can best exploit this kind of technological tools. So of course, these filter bubbles and so on that are becoming a commonplace these days, but it definitely helps to drive this kind of tribalism. And I don't really think that we need a physical tribe and real social interactions in order that we feel ourselves parts of a tribe, or it can be even a substitute. A strong social identity can be a substitute of real, meaningful, everyday conversations and social interactions. Hope it more or less responded your question.
The first part was about the broader historical trajectory of other instances of polarizing politics and probably of a kind of changing attitude towards ideology.
I think what we can observe, I'm not a historian myself, so I try to respond very briefly on that, not to make any mistake, but I think what we could observe to a certain extent before both world wars, especially the second one, but partially the first one as well, that a bit similar logic emerged, but to a way more extreme extent, hopefully, that we can observe these days. The democratic norms that existed in parts of the Europe to a certain extent started a bit erode, which gives a stronger, let's say, dominance of this kind of tribal logic. So I think this kind of eternal fight between the tribal logic and democratic logic, of course not eternal, because democracy is not eternal, but this is this modern conflict. I think it characterized the 20th century, or parts of the 20th century. What is probably even new in these days is that democratic norms in general became a bit stronger, in the sense that even tribal politicians themselves, let's say, I think apart from probably Kim Jong-un and the Chinese leadership, almost no one in the world claims that, you know, I'm just here to represent you because I defeated the other tribe and I have the strongest power. So this kind of democratic legitimacy and seeking for democratic legitimacy, which is part of the populist rhetorical game, is more or less becoming universal. I think the thing is that when it comes to populist rhetoric that seems on the surface to a certain extent democratic, it rather fuels this kind of tribal reactions and undemocratic responses. And to Ivan's question, sorry, could you briefly repeat it?
I'm going to talk to you after. Let's not take it.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, I mean, I didn't have enough room on my paper, and I just don't know where is your question.
No, it's a very important question, one that I've also mentioned in a different way than Ivan. What does it mean to have lived for 70 years in peace for politics, right? Yeah. But, okay, hold your horses, because we're already over time. Thank you, Péter. And as you know, we all have a drink and some food afterwards to continue the discussion. So thanks, Péter.
Thank you. Where to sit? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, these are such rich presentations, all of them, that we could spend a whole afternoon and evening and day in a conference to talk about them. So we move on to Alida Vračić, who's the director of a think tank called Populari. The name she gave this think tank came before the modern use of populism, so maybe she can explain why she gave that title to it. She's also a fellow of the European Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin. Full disclosure, we've known each other for a long time, and when I was a donor at the German Marshall Fund, we supported the think tank efforts in Bosnia and Alida, and she has been working for a long while on issues of demography, or rather migration, immigration, emigration, circular migration, brain drain, brain gain. And she will continue this project. And what's interesting in terms of the Europe's Futures Fellowship, she's worked with Tim Judah also, who was a prior fellow. So we're trying to make various connections between the generations of fellows. Alida.
Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me, because I have this beautiful dress and this cannot be stitched to it, so I have to wear it. Thank you for the kind introduction. Even already explained that I do have a couple of hats at the moment. So I'm a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. I'm very grateful for the IWM to have me here also as a visiting fellow. And I'm also running for 11 and a half, almost 12 years now, a think tank that is based in Bosnia. It's called Populari. It comes from ancient Rome, where you had optimati and populari, basically two streams. One, optimati, were there very close to the sort of governmental circles, or they were part of the establishment. And populari were just eccentric people who had really brilliant ideas, not often being really listened, but they do have these kind of, they had these good ideas. So we have decided to call ourselves that way. As Ivan said, I will be talking going from theory to practice, very much so. I will be talking about emigration from the Western Balkans and everything that is related to that. That question has been with me for already quite some time. I have been working on two different studies that I would definitely recommend you to read, that I have done for the European Council on Foreign Relations. One is basically taking a stock of what is happening in the Western Balkans, why this is a question we should have been discussing even before, but even now. But also it touches upon why Europe should be interested in this question. And the second part of it is me going into sort of a little bit deeper, taking a look into what can be done to basically not to prevent people of departing from the region, but how to make use of it. And what's the best way to start talking about immigration is numbers. Now, numbers come in here with some caveat, because, as Ivan said, Tim Judah has been working quite a lot on numbers and demography and immigration in the Western Balkans. And one has to be extremely careful, because not only that we have censuses that are not necessarily something to be very, to trust 100%, but numbers are being taken in a manipulative ways from all sorts of parties for all sorts of purposes. So one has to be really careful when we speak about immigration, and who comes in and who comes out. With one important sort of addendum to that, that not even well-developed countries are very, very worse when it comes to immigration numbers, simply because we always count people that are in the country, not necessarily people that are going outside. So according to going back to one point that we had previously, that migration is always being very, very often in the past couple of years being mentioned as the most prominent issue. Study from April 2019 by the ECFR basically showed that the EU majority is not anymore concerned that much with migration. But now, prominently, we're talking about emigration, we're talking about corruption, we're talking about health services, we're talking about unemployment. So basically, it comes handy with my topic as well. Now, the first part of it is basically taking a stock. And so the emigration itself is not very, very, how to say, new in the Western Balkans. We had this Gastarbeiter phenomena in the 1960s, when basically Yugoslav government was signing different types of agreements with countries such as Austria and Germany, trying to export unemployment, because unemployment figures were very, very actually similar to what you have seen, what you can see nowadays in the Western Balkans. In order to export that, in order to show that governments are being proactive, they have signed various agreements, and people were going to Germany to work on Baustelle, in construction, to build buildings, houses, what you have, and basically send remittances back. Now, the difference between that emigration in the 60s and immigration that I will be discussing here is that you had predominantly men, farmers, and low-skilled people going in the 60s. With immigration nowadays, you have highly skilled people, and also a fair share of women as well that emigrate. And we're talking about also families, the entire families. So it's a very different dynamic. And now looking into these highly skilled components, I will be telling you a little bit like what this means actually on the ground. So, so if you look at, for example, there are two sectors that I'm particularly interested in. One is education and the second one is health. Now why? Because if you have no doctors, you will have entire families emigrating. If you have no teachers, you will have entire families emigrating because there are no services anymore that they would be wishing to have in the region. In the survey that has been done in Skopje, 69% of assistants, scientists, and researchers have said they would wish to leave the country. Similar figures are going in the rest of the region, so for Albania, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Gallup is doing every now and then surveys, and Bosnia comes in prominently as a country where every second person would want to leave if there is a possibility to leave. Now, what that means in return? That means that you have, on average, between 20 and 50,000 people leaving every single one of these countries every year. Of course, this goes in percentages because if we're talking about small countries such as Montenegro, that number is somewhat different. But we have, for example, Eurostat statistics from last year, 230,000 people left the region. Now, this is a great number of people. Why this matters for health? If you go into the costs, what does this mean? If you have, for example, 300 doctors, as one survey says, 300 doctors has left Bosnia in 2016. To educate one doctor, it takes 150,000 euros throughout his education. If you have annually 300 doctors emigrating, we're talking about millions that are being lost. Recently, there was a study also in Serbia by the Westminster Foundation that calculated at least high-profile sectors, so IT industries, because IT industry is normally better paid than other types of jobs. They're talking about billions. We're talking about 9 billion in projection that will be lost in Serbia due to the fact that IT experts are leaving. And this all really has consequences, great consequences onto the region, because just as an example, like in Sarajevo, which is the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, you have very few specialists left because they all emigrate to Germany and they all emigrate to Austria or some other countries. In Croatia, that has become a full-fledged member in 2013. You also have deserted hospitals because everyone wants to leave, and they dominantly actually decide to go to Ireland and Germany. And this goes into another, I think, a really important point, that all the countries in the Western Balkans are aspiring to become members of the European Union. But then if you look at Croatia, which is our neighbor, and we had been looking at it as a role model in 2013, at the moment when it joined, people started leaving massively. So from 2013 until 2016, around 200,000 people left Croatia. Mostly going to Ireland, also highly skilled, also people that could be useful in their own country. So the myth about joining the EU and stopping emigration just doesn't really stand there. So what are the things that could be done? So what basically I've done is that I was looking for comparatively interesting examples where other countries have experienced high levels of migration, to see basically how the policies are being crafted around this and what can happen if you have a strong diaspora, if you have actually quite a few people around that could be useful one way or the other. Conservative assessment of the Western Balkans diaspora is 6 million people, and this is 5.7 from 2016, so no one really knows what exactly is the number, but I assume it's much greater. If you tap into 6 million potential people that are emotionally still connected to the region, they do send remittances, but think about them as something beyond remittances. Think about how to use their skills, their networks, everything that they know that could be brought into the region. I think we have a great potential that is simply not being used. For such example, I went to Ireland, where I was doing a study on how basically Ireland has developed this diaspora strategy within 30 years' time. And it has become very clear to me within 2 days that this is not something that happens overnight. You need to have an establishment, you need to have a real clear idea what you want to do, and it will take probably a couple of decades. And this is exactly what they've done. Famous speech by Mary Robinson, president at the time, basically was that she left a very, very gloomy Dublin one particular rainy day, which is just every other day probably. And she went to New York to meet diaspora people, Irish people there, and she was just amazed by this optimism and this enthusiasm, this vibrance, energy that she could pick up. And they were all very much interested in what's going on in Dublin and also how to do something about things that are going badly there. And then when she returned, she coined something that I think it really mattered at the time. She basically said that this diaspora, these immigrants, shouldn't be called either diaspora or the immigrants. This is global Irish. So this whole thing is just one thing, and it's basically global Irish. So 4 million being in Ireland versus 70 million out there. And since they have started investing lots into different policy documents, research primarily, trying to understand how this works, what these people are about, what they're thinking about. Are they still angry at the governments? If so, like where and how and what? What they need, what they don't need, how could they contribute, what kind of skills they have, what kind of networks they have. They've started connecting with them already at university level. So if you're like university student at your first year and you will probably go to either Australia or England or somewhere in some traditional place where Irish people go, they would already connect with you at that stage in order to be able to anchor you back at one point if there is an opportunity that comes up in Ireland. Businesses also played a great role in this. Philanthropy as well. There is a great example of Chuck Feeney, a philanthropist from the US with Irish origin, who basically coerced government, Irish government. He has given them 75 million pounds, or he's not given them, but he told them that he's going to give them 75 million pounds if they match funds in order to open a research institute. And they have been sitting in the government for 2 days and 2 nights and maybe even more. And in the end, they have matched it, only to prove to be really one of the best investments ever in Ireland, turning into results of like 1.8 billion within a very short period of time. So that kind of stuff, that kind of sort of approach, Ireland also had. Very good example is also Lithuania within the European sort of circles. Team Judah has been working in Romania. There are pockets in Romania where this is happening, where IT industry is being sort of attracted back or given some incentive to stay there. So in the end, I mean, I think we haven't even started. I mean, this is one of the topics that is being discussed every day among every single person that I know in the Western Balkans. It's very emotionally charged, yet it is nowhere in the politics. Like, there is no politician that we know of that really openly discusses this in frank and honest way, and even not to speak about proposing any policies forward. And I think this makes it even more interesting, because it is definitely one of the topics that you have to encounter when you speak with someone from the Western Balkans. And only recently we had one such example with Nikola Dimitrov, Foreign Minister of North Macedonia, where he basically said that immigration is so bad that, you know, unless North Macedonia gets chance to do something with the European Union, it's going to be even worse. And that's one way to keep people back home, to give them this idea that something is happening, that there is some energy after all in the country. Now, I'm very skeptical about what the European Union itself, membership, opening chapters, closing chapters, negotiating can do. But what I do know is that you have to start opening up this debate in a way that is meaningful and not necessarily pathetic. I mean, this is something that should be discussed in a way where you have this potential sitting somewhere, where you have people being willing to contribute to their home base in one way or the other, but they're simply not being used. And this is where what brings me to another point, which is the circular migration. Just one of the ways how can we start understanding this thing. So basically, sending people somewhere or themselves going somewhere in order to have them back in some shape and form is I think a good start. At the moment, as we speak, Germany is aggressively taking people from the region. When I say aggressively, I mean it aggressively. It's really like there are campaigns in the Western Balkans for health workers, for educators, for all sorts of people that can instantly get onto the German market. And this is very interesting because, you know, on one hand, you have aging population in Germany. I mean, at the moment, there are like, 35 vacant posts for medical workers that are being opened and ready to be filled. You have 2.8 million users of this how you call this, elderly care. And this projection, it will grow like in 10 years' time to double as much. So there will be even more need, and people coming from the Western Balkans are really instantly on the market, because the only thing they have to do is to prove that they've done some work and to get certificates and maybe do some language courses here and there. But even that has been stripped down with the new migration law, because new migration law that has been imposed in Germany, or that has passed in Germany, recently basically stripped down all these requirements. And one of the reasons is that Germany was hoping also after Brexit to attract the best workers, which simply did not happen, because one of the requirements is to know German language, which most people don't, and it takes time to learn. So instead of like 100,000 people that were supposed to be attracted, only 40,000 were attracted in a certain period of time. So on one hand, you have European Union benefiting in a way from this high immigration, and then it leaves region deserted. But at the same time, region does get some remittances, and it gets some skills, and it gets some networks. And one of the positive effects is that you have, for example, in every country of the Western Balkans, you have children, instead of doing anything else, they go for language courses, and of course it's German. And in reality, what happens is that out of 10, 5 will probably leave, but then 5 will stay there for whatever reasons with such skill sets. So they will actually speak German without even, you know, wanting to go in the end. Or they have a role example of a doctor who made it in Germany. They all want to be doctors. They all pursue medical degrees. They get these medical degrees, but for whatever reason, some percentage actually stays back at home. So you have this, you know, impact of sort of seeing what's out there that stays also with the region. And there are hundreds of different possibilities that we could do, and I have a list of those that I'm not sure even if I should go through now, but we can discuss this later on. that could be done for the region to sort of, set itself in a good way to still have this potential within, but also tap into what's out there, what exists in all countries. And I'm not talking about the European Union only, I'm talking about the States, I'm talking about Canada, I'm talking about everywhere where people have started leaving after the conflicts in former Yugoslavia. And just to have be a little bit of a more sort of clear picture how bad this is. In the last 30 years, the Western Balkans has lost 1/10 of its population. And it's really, really going at rapid speed. So this is not something that I don't see any evidence that it'll stop anytime soon. I also don't see that the European process, the accession process itself will stop it either. But what we have to do is to have a breakthrough and to open up this debate among those that are actually making decisions, and to create a platform, which would be part of my project here, to start creating a platform for the policymakers, but not all exclusively from the Western Balkans, but also EU countries that could basically join the efforts and join the schemes. There are hundreds of different things that could be done, and Germany is doing partly something with its development agencies. There are some projects going triple projects, and there are some efforts also in Serbia being done with the government to create an agency for circular migration. All these are sort of good stories, but unless we actually convert them into something that is a meaningful policy, I think we'll be seeing much greater numbers of people leaving, and with no real idea how this could be beneficial in the end for the Western Balkans. And we have enough time for all the questions. I kind of speed it up a little bit, not to be late, and I know that some people have to leave at 6 o'clock as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Alida. This is obviously within the framework of a really broad question. Some of you know that the Institute organized this summer a summer school called Demography and Democracy. Ivan Krastev was involved, Shalini Randaria, our rector. And obviously it's not only a question for the Western Balkans, but for the whole of the Balkans, and I would say Southern Europe, Bulgaria, Romania, yep. Hungary, Greece are really draining in terms of population, both because of economic reasons, also some political reasons. And I think that Ivan Krastev at a conference in Berlin, he was quoted in saying that there is a danger that this part of the region of Europe becomes the reserve labor force repository for Western Europe. And not only is there a danger, it's happening. And you're absolutely right, and I would like to reinforce your point that there are enormous queues, that there is an aggressive, attractive policy by Germany, but not only Germany. Friends in Belgrade tell me that queues are equally long in front of the Slovak embassy, in front of the Czech embassy, and that along with the highly skilled IT and medical people, you have literally are plumbers and electricians that are leaving because you can earn 5 times more in Germany. It's my electrician in Belgrade told me I'm off to Germany, literally. Yeah. I said I'm leaving. So it's extremely dramatic. And finally, before I give the floor to others, just 2 weeks ago, there was news that the International Monetary Fund officially warned Serbia that this will be a huge problem for the growth of the country in several years' time if this dynamic of population leaving continues. Okay, the floor is open. Holly's hand is up first, and then Ivan. Holly, you get the gold medal at the end of your stay here. Okay.
Okay. So I'm going to keep up the old reputation. A couple of things. I was wondering if you've heard of this author by the name of Louis Adamic, who was active in the interwar and immediate post-war period. He wrote a book called The Two-Way Passage, he was Slovene, I think, by origin, and the idea behind his model was that people should consciously think about coming back from being in the United States and Canada in particular as part of bringing these kinds of skills. And I think, maybe you know, was he killed by Tito's people? Something like that. I mean, so he fell on the wrong side of the immediate post-war Yugoslav debates and didn't make it. Yeah, but it would be kind of interesting to see the trajectory of this in the past, this kind of model. One of the things that your talk made me think of is private universities in the United States and the way that they treat alumni, and the way that they think about, building up support among people who are no longer there and who are never going to be there again, except occasionally, but they also are seen as potential donors for the purpose of creating endowments. I'm wondering if this is the model that you're thinking of, that somehow that people become more like alumni of an organization, or alumni of a state, if you will, then act as potential donors. I don't know how I would feel about that model, but it's kind of interesting. The other is on the subject of scarcity. It seems to me as though, one of the themes here is, on the one hand, there is extreme scarcity of labor in some places. Like, you read the German newspapers and it's like the medical sector is a catastrophe. There's not enough people to take care of sick people, and they're in a constant state of alarm. There was an article today about psychiatric institutions and how violence is on the rise because there aren't enough people to de-escalate situations in psychiatric institutions, and they need X more staff. And so, on the one hand, there's scarcity there. On the other hand, there's scarcity in the places that people are leaving. So you can't find a carpenter or a plumber in rural Romania or whatever. But there's also something else. I wonder if, because one of the underpinning ideas behind, why it is all of this is happening with politics is that, there's a sense that there's some kind of zero-sum dynamic at play, and we're either going to win or we're going to lose, and if we win, then and other people lose, and if they win, then we lose. And I'm wondering if part of this zero-sum perception of the moment, that it's, that not everybody benefits, is because of this pretty radical movement of people. But if this might also not be temporary, if you look at some of the way that labor flows have happened over time. I was talking to a carpenter the other day who had been in Greece. The Greek economy tanked. He came from Romania, went to Greece. Greek economy tanked. He comes to Austria, right? And he keeps connections in both Romania and Greece. He goes to Greece regularly because he has his religious friends there. And so it seems to me as though there are lots of things going on with this labor market that are as yet invisible and that are destined to change. You yourself said that the preoccupation used to be migration and now it's emigration. How long did that take? That was 2015, right? That's not that long ago. And isn't it possible that if you consider in Hungary, now there are a bunch of Ukrainians coming to Hungary. What does that mean for Ukraine, right? And is it going to be these countries that are the places that where are the sucking labor flows, or is the dynamic going to be something completely different in 5 years' time? And so I'm just wondering whether, fixating on the kind of crisis attitude of the moment might overlook some of the, the patterns that are likely to change in 5 years anyway, for various reasons. What if, the British economy tanks then, or if they stop, allowing people who are EU citizens to stay, then something's going to happen, but we don't know exactly what it is. And so, there are a lot of things on the horizon that are likely to change the constellation. And how much should we try to think about the possibility that this isn't all, necessarily catastrophic?
Very good.
Ludger, you wanted?
Yeah, I also want to continue because there is not simply that people are living, but they are living in an area in which, because people have been living Eastern Europe for a long time, but normally they were living in societies that had a high population growth like everybody. So you have this combination between demographic decline, fertility rate which is below reproduction, and emigration, which is creating the problem for the short term. So from this point of view, even if Holly is right, that probably they're going to be returned, the problem is how long this society can wait. And I'm going to give some figures basically from Romania. For the period 2007-2017, 3.4 million people has left, 70% of them younger than 40. And I want to push you also on the political side of it. Because we're talking about only economy, but paradoxically, this is also very much changing the electoral body. Because when people outside of the country, basically they're going to be less active in voting and so on and so on. So all these ideas, all this problem for democratic change and basically reforms and others are very much this is an obstacle, and we have now quite a lot of data showing that in regions, for example, in East Germany, where you have kind of a population older than 60, missing young people and others, these are the regions that have a highest support for the far right. Even more, in their way to keep people staying in the country, some of these nationalistic leaders started to use a very strong anti-Western rhetoric in order to mobilize kind of a nationalistic pride. Don't go, don't betray the country. Albanian Prime Minister Rama went on television and said to the doctors, don't leave your fathers and mothers alone and so on, be patriot. So paradoxically, this type of an emigration is also one of the resources for the nationalistic mobilization. I don't believe it's going to be effective, but it is also changing the character of politics. And I do believe this combination, not only the economic, but also kind of the political part of it is interesting to be taken account, including some of the anti-European sentiments. And I'm going to stop here. But when, during the European elections in Bulgaria, you're asking some old people why basically you're getting more skeptical on the EU, and they said the EU basically has stolen our doctors and our children. So in a certain way, you have also kind of an areas which politically become very much more difficult. So this part of it is also critically important. But and this is my last issue. But this focus on return is making the situation very difficult because these regions, in order economically to survive the short term, need migration. The more they do believe that people are going to return easily, the more hostile they're going to be to any type of migration. So in a certain way, all this kind of a dream of our own kids returning is the way for the governments to say, let's not allow others to come because we hope they're going to come back. So I'm interested also how you're reading this one.
Why don't you answer those two questions and then we'll go to the next round.
Okay, so even everything that you have mentioned is really in the cloud. There's very little research being done on this to begin with. I mean, if we're talking about political implications, on one hand, you do have people that emigrated 30 years ago after the conflict in former Yugoslavia, now being sort of, you know, considering themselves German, sitting in Germany and voting for AfD. And then you have those, I mean, recently there was a study, there was a survey actually, not actually a full study, that shows that Serbian people in diaspora are less concerned with issues such as Kosovo, such as whatever national identity, but they're more interested in corruption. They're more interested in what can be done in the country and how they can contribute. So I think this is a changing thing, maybe possibly a changing string that we could be working on. And this is why I imply that, you know, there is a potential out there, because unless we go out and ask these people how would they engage in order to come back, we wouldn't necessarily know, including their political attitudes. But this requires panel surveys that are simply not being done, because this is not a topic that has been as researched. And as for the demographic decline, this is also a coupling issue. I mean, there are some statistics here that I have taken, and I mean, how bad it is. It basically is now at what, like 12% of people over 65, and according to some projection, it's going to be up to 20-something within a couple of years. I mean, a decade or so. So we're talking about serious decline, apart from some countries in the region, but the rest of it enjoys exactly the same status as the Western Europe. So it's really, I think there is a necessity, and this is why I like to compare Ireland, because they have started from zero, not knowing anything about the diaspora, what they're up to, where they are, what they do. And only recently they've started doing research on, for example, Abu Dhabi and Dubai. not knowing what Irish are anyway doing in Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And I mean, then you know, a couple of years after, there was something else. There was some other geographical point. But I think this is what has to be done in order to understand more dynamics and their thinking about engagement, one way or the other, including political one. That is really, really interesting. I think that can change also dynamics within the region. Then what other questions? Holly, I really do hope that I didn't sound that gloomy. I don't think it's catastrophic at all. I think it's necessary. I think migration is really necessary, and for the Western Balkans, like for Romania and other countries, it's vital. What we do not think through is how to make it, you know, not only beneficial for one party. And at the moment, it really is, in a way, you know, apart from remittances, where we end our thinking about it, there's not much going on. Like, for example, in the Western Balkans, if you discuss with any person from the World Bank or any, you know, a business person or someone who works in the Chamber of Commerce, they keep on talking about FDI. No one ever has mentioned, until I've done this research, something called DDI, Diaspora Direct Investments, which is another model to be basically, you know, used and implemented in the region, because it's much easier to implement it. Most of the know-how stays within the region because it's something that anyway comes, you know, from someone who is originally from the region. There are all sorts of schemes that we could have been, you know, seriously sort of thinking of in order to make it less catastrophic. So I don't think it's catastrophic. I don't want to sound like Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, President of Croatia, who basically a year ago said, facing with the numbers of Croatians leaving, she said that this whole concept of a mobility of the European Union is just something to be completely revised because it doesn't work. Everyone is going to leave. I don't think you could stop anyone to if they want, and if they're smart, and if they want to pursue anything out there, there is no way to stop people to go. What you can do is to possibly, you know, offer them something, some incentives to contribute back in some shape and form, and I'm being very flexible about this, because not everyone has to return. That's not the point. If you can come and give a talk about something that you know, something that is so rare, and you're a specialist on it, I think it's more probably, you know, beneficial than returning and not doing anything elsewhere in some other place. So it's really it's more about using potential in a more sort of flexible way, not very fixed. Yeah.
Yeah. Just a brief comment. You're absolutely right, Holly. There's much more than meets the eye, and there's an example of the Serbian Business Club in London. These are young professionals in their late 20s, 30s who have come together spontaneously because some have wanted to return. They've organized, and they organize themselves ways in which they can return into managerial posts, into various companies back home. And they've sort of started their own kind of mini circulation. So there are a lot of that. On what the diaspora can do, having lived in the States and having talked to leaders of the Serbian diaspora, they have one big complaint on possible direct investment. They're going to screw us. They want our money, and you know they'll racketeer us. And there've been a lot of bad examples. So it's also a question about the state capture, corruption, etc., to have sort of clean ways in which they can do it. The other ways they do it is through philanthropy, you know, scholarships for bright students, etc. So again, there's lots of negatives and positives, and I'm sure certain diasporas work better than others. Okay, so there was the question back there. The young colleague.
Yes, okay. Okay, thank you for. My comment is quite short, and if there is some kind of analogy between what happened with Industrial Revolution when the villages were spread out and concentrated into the cities, and what is happening right now is that the whole states will be, in some sense, emptied like villages during the Industrial Revolution and concentrated into the cities. And yeah, that would be my question. Maybe to ask to see in a positive perspective, which is quite difficult, I think. But let's assume that if whole places and whole states will be depopulated from people. It is, from a certain way, it is quite good, let's say, good way for the nature, because the nature can flourish again. So for me, just to when we see the Chernobyl series, the nature again can concentrate it in the places that were previously populated. And so, for me, from global perspective, let's assume that all the European will be concentrated in very narrow places, and the nature around can flourish, like when you see Hong Kong and so on. The cities are quite concentrated, and the nature around is flourishing, because the people are concentrated on one place. So if I can assume this, let's say, good perspective from the nature.
It's a brilliant point. I haven't thought about it. It's in environmental sort of a sense, but it...
Yeah.
Let's take another question. Yeah.
It's like, no, it's
oh, no. Well.
Yeah, over there.
So I come from Romania. It's a country who has a higher immigration rate than China or Mexico, or anyway, it's huge. We have like 17% of our people away already. And I was curious, besides Ireland, if you have any other examples. For example, Poland. I mean, I'm not even sure if it's a phenomenon that people are going back, or to which extent, or how come they're returning. Is this true? I mean, if you have some insights on this case, I would be very interested.
Let's go.
Thank you.
Yeah, about the figures, yes, I'm a bit confused about some of the figures, including the most recent one. You said 70% of Romania. I thought it's 17. Okay, so it's three and some million. Okay, 3 and some millions. Okay. No, for instance, 69% of the researchers want to leave the country. Across the European Union, for instance, not just researchers, but the overall labor force. If you ask people who wants to live at least for several years abroad in some other country, is 62% who claim to want to do it. Mm-hmm. And it's actually 2 to 3% who do it. So between words and deeds and desires and what people actually, there is some difference. What do the figures mean if you would say 20 to 60,000 people leave a country each year? A small country like Austria, as long as we were a very poor country in the interwar period, the failed state, hundreds of thousands of people have left, including to Czechoslovakia, Romania, all the neighboring countries where people can now come from to Austria. And even in the post-war period up to the 60s, Austria was poor enough to have people going to Switzerland, Germany, Sweden, everywhere, just leaving the country. And it turned completely around with the 60s and ever since. Now, is it little or much if 20 or 60,000 people leave in Croatia, say, on average? I don't know. It depends on how many people come. If, in Austria, 120,000 people come is against 100,000 people leaving, what's the problem? It's very good, because the population doesn't wither away as it does in other countries. So it may combine itself with depopulation, but it may as well be with population increase. Even if you have a net immigration rate, if there's enough, natural population growth, this doesn't matter. Some countries really have very serious problems, from Romania to Bulgaria. If 500,000 people disappear from the labor market in Bulgaria, this may be good for the old age caretakers in Austria, but or for the patients of the old people from Bulgaria in Austria, but of course it's a disaster. Or Moldova is the most dramatic example. Moldavian Republic, this is really very, very serious, because if a third of the population leaves the country, and not just 10, 15, 20%, you are really in very, very big trouble. So I think it depends on the overall. Is there circular migration? Circular migration, of course, is a very great chance, even if people live only for you know, a year of apprenticeship, of learning, of skill formation, of adopting, as I heard in Kosovo. Well, if people start to adopt German work discipline and come back, this would be the big, you know. So you may have this kind of cliches as well.
Yep.
Do we think in terms of? I found Holly's idea about this, you know, expats giving donations, doing, you know, not just sending remittances back. I didn't understand whether you said people now send not as many remittances any longer.
It's getting lesser, but
less,
still it is a portion
so because
of the
it's
budget.
less male, it's less low skilled, it's more skilled, and it's more female immigration. I was surprised to see that the remittances have gone back, because what you see when you go to Moldova, if you go to Ukraine, Western Ukraine, when you go to Eastern Romania, is all those conspicuous consumption items in front of very poor housing and, you know, communities where people living in Italy or mostly in Italy or in other Latin European countries. So obviously there are still important remittances. About the diaspora, you know, Mr. Orban claims that there are 10 million Hungarians, but another 5 million living abroad. They're all Hungarians, but they live in the Vojvodina, or in Slovakia, or in Austria, or in California. In Hollywood, I think there may be more, Beverly Hills, there may be more Hungarians than in many Hungarian cities. One can, you know, the question is, how long do you count Hungarians as Hungarians? How many generations should pass by when you call, you know, Beverly Hills inhabitants true Hungarians? Building a community of expats, of people who help to bring about progress in their country back home is really the thing to achieve, and whether this works. You know, the Austrians have tried hard. They called it the 10. Bundesland, you know, the 10th region among the 9 Länder there where they have. It didn't work greatly for all kinds of reasons, which were very interesting to look into. Why didn't it work despite these great efforts to build such a diaspora community linked back?
Hungarian, then you are in Hungarian, I'd say. This is simply.
So then my wife must be Hungarian, except that she's Romanian, you know. Yeah. But her first language is Hungarian, and German, and not Romanian. So, is this enough? I'm not sure.
Or if you say that you are Hungarian,
yeah. Mother tongue, I'm not so sure whether this works.
Good mother tongue.
Okay, just a very short, rather a remark, then I won't overburden you with one more question about the positive examples. Because Ivan already talked about nationalist politics, that not always very unhappy about these people leaving the countries, still having the remittances, so do not really voting there, do not really protesting there, but at the same time boosting the economy. In Hungary, for example, it's way easier to vote as an ethnic Hungarian. Even you don't need you can just send your vote via letter, but if you live in London or in Vienna or so on, it's really difficult to vote. So there is some selectivity. But what happened in Hungary is that there was a movement that was built up, a political movement, practically on the basis of the young expats who were learning in foreign countries and who were working in foreign countries. And the Momentum Party, which is right now Liberal Party, has about 10% support still, rather some fresh air in Hungarian politics. Its identity was definitely that, okay, we tried ourselves in the West. Right now we want to change do some change in Hungary, and it really served as a magnet for many youngsters to come back to Hungary and do politics. Of course, if it would have failed, then all of them would have left again, but it proves to be successful, and at least in the short run. So even politically, there can be some such kind of positive examples.
Absolutely.
And back there.
Hi. There's two things I'd like to say on this. Firstly, I've lived outside the UK now for about 17 years, and that's like enriched my experience of life enormously. So I myself have been a migrant, and I've lived outside my own country for a long time, and that's helped me enormously in kind of understanding the world. So that's one side. But more on the downside, I think we don't have to look far to see what might happen to, let's say, the Western Balkans and the Balkans in general. I mean, surely we can look at the states that were on the losing side of the American Civil War, Kentucky, Tennessee. We can see that, unfortunately, no, there isn't going to be a romantic reversion to nature in these places. They're going to be turned into chicken farming, logistic places, the places, let's say, industries which are too dirty or too regulated to function within, let's say, the core countries. And I think even in Hungary now, in the regions now, you can see that exact model is being and has been implemented. And when we talk about economic growth in Hungary, it's more or less, at least in the regions, based upon that model exactly. And so the challenge is, I think, for anyone who regards that as being a suboptimal outcome, is the infrastructure, the economy of somewhere like Kentucky could actually be replicated across the periphery of the European Union. And I think we've sort of hinted at this occasionally, but I thought it was right to kind of spell that out. You will have reactionary politics, and you will have a depleted economy. And I think, I think you can see it now in Hungary. Even in, I think, historical examples, if you look at the story of the Habsburg Empire, how desperately poor the rural areas of the Habsburg Empire were. There's no reason to think that anything has changed in this regards. So it's a dangerous development, I would say, without inward, let's say, rather even contrived planning in the areas themselves to replace some of what's going away. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me try, because there are questions from the environment towards why Austria failed with its diaspora strategy, to whether this is a short-term issue, and Kentucky in the end. I think there is an overarching thing here in all these questions, and it's basically, the change of narrative. Why other countries, why there is no, for example, Bernd, what you said about, why making drama over 20 or 60%? When you have a fluctuation of people, when people come in and they go out, and it happens constantly, and they come from everywhere and anywhere, this is not an issue. You can talk about 15 and you can talk about 90%. It doesn't matter. This is more or less what Ireland has done by opening up. Unlike all other countries, they have opened up towards European Union and Romania and Bulgaria and other countries, and they've started attracting. Only last year, they have reported a little bit of incline in their own population, so attracting Irish back. But it wasn't targeting only Irish, it was attracting everyone else. So, even people from the UK after Brexit, people from Romania, people from Croatia, everyone and anyone who wants to come into the country. And then, if you can replace every doctor with another doctor, this is not an issue. However, this is not what's happening in the Western Balkans. And this is why these statistics matter, because if you have 69% wanting to leave, and bear in mind that these surveys are being done, with other questions attached. So it's really about motivation to leave, but to leave, and never come back. This is the point. Then you have alarm, bell over there, because it's not something that should be overlooked, and it's not something that is going to be quickly fixed in a short period of time. And this is why we talk about percentages the way we do. With, as I said at the beginning, one has to be extremely careful when we use numbers in the Western Balkans, because they have been manipulated for all sorts of reasons. Why also, like going back to your question on we have tried and we have failed. I think there are different ways to do it, and we're also not talking about immigration from 30 years. These are virtual immigrants. Everything is happening electronically in some other world. You know, it's not the same. They don't queue up and look for visas and go to other places by, you know, the same traditional way. But networks that are existing in the virtual world are completely different. I think we completely overlook the potential that sits within this IT generation of emigrants. Also, the change of narrative in a sense that, you know, we have to rebrand it. We don't call it anymore, you know, we don't imply something catastrophic, but we rebrand it as a potential. I mean, what I've heard in other countries that managed to attract people back or attract other people, not their own people, is really, you know, saying like, it's fine. When you study, you go abroad, you pursue other things, you know, you learn languages, and then you come back and you do something. It's in the Western Balkans, this is not happening. This is not like, you know, you go there and obtain something and like, you know, get yourself exposed to all sorts of amazing things and come back. But it's like go and never return. And this is I think, a great problem. As for the environment, I completely agree with you. It would flourish, it would be amazing. But here we touch upon something I think really important. I lived in Berlin in the last couple of years, and you know, you can also see it in countries such as Germany. You also see this, I think we shouldn't mix it up, urban and rural or periphery. In Brandenburg, you also have no doctors. It's like exactly the same story like you would hear in any other country of the Western Balkans. No doctors, no teachers, everyone is leaving, probably environment is flourishing, but this is pretty much the story. And I can understand the point of, you know, a serious country that comes up with its own migration strategy saying we will get what we can suck into the system. And we will do it, you know, whatever it takes. So I can understand that point of view. At the same time, you know, I don't think Balkans is too far. In 2 weeks in Vienna that I met like dozens of experts, you know, anywhere and everywhere in Vienna. So this is basically where the Balkan starts. So everything that happens down there, and if you have no doctors, you will have entire families emigrating because now no longer they can rely on services. But they had good, you know, jobs there, and they were actually quite okay there. But now, because of this, they will want to leave. And this is a problem that will eventually, you know, come to Austria. It will come to Germany. It will come to any of the countries. So I think in that point, we have to think about it very much long term. And going back also to Holly's point, is this a short-term issue that will change anyway, and something else we will be thinking of? You're completely right. In 2015, it was migration. Everyone was about, you know, Syrian refugees coming to Germany and what can be done about that. Agreements with Turkey, all sorts of things. Now we're not discussing that. Now we're like a little bit more into some other topics. We cannot project what's going to happen because there are, you know, other things happening. And the Western Balkans is a really, really small region, and only strong if you see it as a one thing, but other small specific countries don't mean anything because we're talking about really small places. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we for sure know that this is going to be deserted in a way, maybe not like Kentucky, although there are some, you know, you have mentioned some dirty industry and these kind of things, that this is already happening. You know, there is a borderline between Croatia and Bosnia, and now Croatia, as a full-fledged member of the European Union, wants to dump its dirtiest industry there close to Bosnian border because Bosnia can't do anything about it or can't do much about it. So this is also, you know, there are dynamics in that direction as well. Hopefully not, this is not the full scenario. And politically attractive, what Péter, you have described. I remember living in Bosnia and being in Bosnia in 2008, when there was an energy created within Bosnia around European integrations. And there was a really, you know, really good people in good places. Director for the European integrations, Minister of Foreign Affairs, doing things, you know, not just talking about things. You had dozens of people that I know myself coming back from all sorts of fellowships, Chevening scholars, Fulbright scholars, coming back and working with these institutions as civil servants and really working to do something about their country. It lasted 2.5 years. And then there was a significant drop. And they have left. And they're gone. And now some other people are there. But these people are sitting somewhere. I keep on meeting them from time to time. And there is this is what I keep on trying to explain, I don't know how successfully, that there are people like Serbian City Club in London sitting and discussing every day what can be done in Serbia, what can be done in Bosnia, how can we engage, and not to wear out ourselves in the process because we have been there, we have done that. So what are the models? What are the small concrete things, entry points we can do something about it? And this is what I want us to be reminded of all the time, because I think it matters, because this is the energy that we need. And I'm always making this analogy with this speech in Dublin and then going to New York, where you see people that are, with the time distance and some physical distance, you see things a little bit different. I see my region completely differently in Vienna than I see it when I'm in Sarajevo. Because there you easily get sucked in, and then everything is terrible and pessimistic and very few things can be done. But then if you move away a little bit and you see other things happening that are not necessarily all that amazing and glossy, then you get to the point of having ideas how it can be done. And I think this is where I would like to basically head to with some policy proposals, with very, very concrete things that could be implemented, like low-hanging fruits that are everywhere, but we just overlook them because we keep on thinking about abstracts, and we keep on thinking about whatever. I mean, first thing first, like can we do a labor survey in the Western Balkans? Like to begin with, some simple things that can be done, and they don't even cost that much, and that would be the start of much greater things.
Thank you, Alida, very much. I just want to say that remembering your beginnings at Populari and the first papers that you produced, they were really a breath of fresh air, because it was not all doom and gloom and there's no future for, in your case, Bosnia and Herzegovina, but you were really picking out examples. Yeah, the road is very long. Many of us here are part of this story. We're outside our countries. But again, because of the nature of the world we live in and the media, we're also, at least I am living with at least half of my soul and brain back home. I read the local newspapers first thing when I get up, and I go back and vote when I can. So it is different than that Gastarbeiter phenomenon in the 60s. And also, you take your Uber, and half my Uber drivers are from Serbia or Bosnia, and I ask, when were you there? Oh, last weekend, or 3 weekends ago. So there's a lot of va-et-vient, and if nothing else, they are consuming products, going to restaurants or something. So there's more than meets the eye. Does it make a difference? Of course it doesn't, because the vector now is to come abroad. And the question is, and Holly's question is completely right, will things change? And then Ivan's question, what does it mean for actually the political vote? Do these Uber drivers then go back and vote, and for whom they vote, and how do they vote? I think that's a fundamental question, and that is something that we can tackle all together as you move forward. So please join me in thanking Alida. And because there's no free wine and cheese, you've all worked hard, so please come down and have a glass of wine and some sandwiches.